inviting me here tonight. I've already had a wonderful time talking to so many good people who are so deeply committed to open and democracy and transparent and inclusive democracy. It's a pleasure to be with you. I also want to thank Doreen and Janet Ward for all the help that they've given me in making this visit such a pleasure. And I want to congratulate you on your victory yesterday. I believe you had a unanimous vote in committee for one of the things that you've been fighting for. So it's really exciting for me to have this privilege, really, of being able to travel around the country and see how people are responding to what we're facing now. Moving into my formal remarks, I'm going to start with a prediction that might surprise you, especially given the events of the last few weeks. And that is, the prediction is that when future historians look back on our moment, say 30, 40 years from now, and try to make sense of it, I don't think that they're going to focus on Donald Trump. I don't. I think they will be more interested in a quiet transformation underway that the current occupant of the White House's conduct distracts our attention from. And that is an ingenious, slow takeover by the Koch-led radical right of core branches of our government. Starting at the state level after the Operation Red Map that I'm sure some of you are familiar with in 2010. Think of Scott Walker in Wisconsin in that year. Moving on to the federal courts, Congress, and the executive branch, with assistance from an infrastructure of hundreds of organizations funded by these billionaire and multimillionaire donors who seek to remake our country to their liking by stealth, as I will explain. This anti-democratic infrastructure now includes dozens of ostensibly separate national bodies, such as the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Federalist Society. It includes over 150 state-level organizations whose work is aligned through the State Policy Network, including your Granite Institute and the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy. It includes organizing enterprises such as Americans for Prosperity, Concerned Veterans for America, the Libre Initiative, and Generation Opportunity. And it includes centers at colleges and universities, with George Mason University, which I wrote about in the book, as the flagship, but faculty now at over 300 colleges now getting funding from the Charles Koch Foundation alone. And as those future historians who look back on our era tell the inspiring story of the 11th hour organizing that stymied the billionaires' bid for control, because we know this is going to be stopped, right? As they tell the amazing story of that resistance, the topic I'll come back to, they will also, though, have to credit the genius of the Koch long game. And they will trace how the quiet focus of the Koch network on trying to destroy the power of the strongest barriers to its project, particularly education unions, which are now the largest and the most progressive in America, but also others, as they focus on that effort to destroy the power of the barriers to this project, while also radically altering the rules of the political process. They will show how those things together enabled the progression of this stealth takeover to the point that we see today, which no one would have imagined possible in 2008. And I know this may be painful, but I think it would be helpful to go back and remember how you felt after the 2008 election. That sense of hope, of possibility, of a world about to be remade. And I think the difference between that feeling and where we are now is in some ways the measure of the kind of network that I've talked about and its impact. So my research for Democracy and Change, it exposes how this happened and why, and it also explains what the Koch endgame will mean for the vast majority of people who will be devastated if this project succeeds. It aims to destroy much of the public sector, our public education system. They seek to privatize. They seek to undermine the power of working people to come together in labor unions. They seek to stop action on the environment. But the ultimate agenda is much more radical than that. And you'll realize that, I think, as I go on. I don't want to summarize here the narrative that anchors the book's arguments, but I will say this. And that is that the story starts in late 1956, and that's where I picked up the trail. Starts in late 1956 when the state of Virginia was leading the wider white South in what they called a policy of massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, the federal desegregation decision, the Supreme Court desegregation decision. And that policy of massive resistance did a number of things. Most importantly, it provided tax-funded vouchers for segregated private schools that would be beyond the reach of the federal courts. It also required the closure of public schools that planned to desegregate, which led to 13,000 white children being shut out of schooling for the whole fall of 1958 because their local communities were about to comply with the federal courts. And it led to black children in Prince Edward County, Virginia, being denied public education for 5 years. This massive resistance policy also took away the First Amendment rights of the NAACP in the name of liberty. Now, we tend to remember that fight, that massive resistance fight that swept the South as the last gasp of Jim Crow. But what I found in my research was that it was also the first big opportunity for the cause of free market fundamentalism to find a mass audience among those disgruntled whites. And the founders of that free market fundamentalist cause took advantage of this, of that white anger. They flocked to the state of Virginia in this contest and were thrilled at the prospect of tax subsidies for private segregated schools. And I'm talking about people like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, all these luminaries were applauding Virginia's private school subsidies. Of that crucible in civil rights era Virginia, I'll only say one more thing now. And that is that the author, Maya Angelou, was right when she wrote, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Because it turns out that what we are seeing now in America, most dramatically in Charlottesville, but in so many other places and in so many other ways, what we are seeing now is not the first time that the libertarian right has relied on white supremacy to advance an otherwise unpopular agenda. What I want to convey to you tonight, though, is not that story, but rather the value added of my research for people like you who are working to defend democracy on a daily basis, to reform it, to realize its promise. And I will state my case plainly here, and it is that the radical right has been winning over the last decade like never before in its history because the Koch network has effectively weaponized the ideas of a figure who is little known to the mainstream or to the left, to most people in this country, and don't worry, I'd never heard of his name before I set to work, so don't feel bad if you haven't, but someone who supplied the crucial ideas that are in play on the right now, much as Milton Friedman did the right of an earlier generation. This figure's name was James McGill Buchanan, and he was the first U.S. Southerner to win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, which he did in 1986 for work that he had actually started during that Southern schools crisis in Virginia. He called his approach public choice economics, and he billed it as providing an economic analysis of politics. But the real mission of this new school of thought, I found in the archives, was to discredit government action so that there would be no trusted alternative to rule by the market, and also essentially to protect, in today's terms, the makers, the job creators, as they like to call themselves, from the takers, which would be the rest of us, the retirees, the people who need public education, the environmentalists, etc. We are seen in this school as the takers. So I learned through this research that today's right is using a playbook derived from James Buchanan's ideas to undermine the power on which progressive public policy depends, the collective power, and then to rig the rules of the political game in their own favor at every step. As Charles Koch put it to a donor summit late last year, he said, "We have made more progress over the last 5 years than I was able to make in the previous 50. So he's been at this for a very long time and feels like things are really coming together now. So by following these ideas from their origins in civil rights era Virginia to the present, I think we gain at least 3 important resources that are really helpful for this work of defending and advancing democracy. The first thing we get is a deep understanding of the Koch network's operational strategy, its real operational strategy, including how that strategy might be blunted. The second thing that we gain is a history that exposes why this radical right adopted what I call a stealth strategy. And that was precisely because its architects knew that the majority would stop their plan if people became aware of what this was really about and where it's heading. And I actually see that as the single most important finding of my research, this anti-majoritarian element, that they thought that they could pull this off through rules change and other means because they don't want the people to know, because the people would stop it. Third, I think we gain knowledge of what the ultimate Koch endgame is. And that endgame, which they wisely don't announce to the rest of us, is an incredibly radical transformation of our governing institutions, our legal system, and frankly, our social and ethical norms. Its purpose is to, in time, force, to impose total personal responsibility on the people. It would do that by undercutting our capacity to do the kinds of things that citizens for generations have looked to government for help with. From public education and public health measures, to retirement security, to anti-discrimination laws, environmental protection, and more. The plan is, over time, to bind our political process in such a way as to make the government unable to comply with the will of the people, at least where the popular will involves tax transfers and government regulation, which is basically most of governance. So what we're seeing then is far more than partisan. And I think this is really important to understand, that the old labels and ways of saying things just don't make sense in trying to understand this. This is not about liberals versus conservatives or Republicans versus Democrats. It's much more profound in a way than that. It is a messianic plan, decades in the making now, to fundamentally change the relationship between the people and the government, and to do so permanently in a manner that aims, by design, to pin the proverbial pendulum to the right so that it can never swing back again, no matter what the people want. So to grasp why having this plan of action matters, let me quote the head of Koch Industries Government and Public Affairs Operation, Mark Holden, gloating to a donor summit in late 2015. He said this: "We're close to winning. They don't have the real path. They don't have the real path." He was speaking of journalistic critics of the Koch network, but he might as well have been speaking of the rest of the citizenry. I believe I found that real path through my research, through a lot of serendipity. That's not the talk I'm giving tonight, but I've told some of you, privately, and I'd be happy to say more, but a lot of coincidence here. In any event, the path starts with gaining control over an ever-growing number of states, now 30. It then moves through those state legislatures to alter the rules of the political process in each one in a way that is also designed to choke progressive national and local policy too. Among the pivotal changes are some that may be familiar to you. The most radical and sophisticated gerrymander in our political history to enable disproportionate representation of political minority. Hamstringing labor unions, especially teachers' unions, as I mentioned, the most powerful and progressive in today's America. Undermining other strong liberal lobbies, such as Planned Parenthood, which also works for public health across the board. And then with these core defenders of democracy weakened, the strategy moves into the next phase. And I've seen all this up close in North Carolina, by the way, with voter suppression, privatization of public resources to alter power relations, we can talk about that more, and preemption by state legislatures of local progressive wins, whether for living wages or anti-discrimination or environmental measures, and then even attempts to undermine the independence of state judiciaries and more. So what is this real path driving towards through the control of these growing number of states, the changes in the rules, the voter suppression, the redistricting, and all the rest? It is driving toward the ultimate radical rules change, altering the US Constitution at the first and only state-convened constitutional convention since 1787. The goal is to amend our Constitution in a manner that would curtail what progressive social movements have accomplished, not just since the 1960s or since the 1930s, but actually going back to the 1910s. This may sound exaggerated, impossible, etc., I know, but bear with me because the evidence shows it is actually moving along as we speak. In fact, 2 weeks ago, Wisconsin's outgoing Governor Scott Walker, who lost his job in 2018 and had to find something else to do. Scott Walker was named honorary chairman of one of the organizations pushing for such a constitutional convention. And consider this, while the eyes of journalists and citizens have been fixated for a long time, almost exclusively on Washington, and lately, overwhelmingly on the man I've come to think about as the distractor-in-chief, organizations and elected officials funded by Charles Koch and his donor network, with ALEC in the lead, have been quietly lining up the authorizations needed to call such a convention. They now have the backing of 28 of the 34 states required. Some background on this, since we've never used it, people are unfamiliar with this method, but Article 5 of the Constitution provides 2 ways to amend the Constitution. One is the method that we know, and many good things have come from that, some silly things like prohibition, but mostly lots of good things with lots of public deliberation and sunshine. The other route to amendment that's never been tried is a convention convened by state legislatures. And it is so radical, because the Constitution provides no guardrails, that it has never been done, because every legal expert who is not on the Koch payroll or in that orbit would tell you it would necessarily be a runaway convention, where everything would be potentially up for grabs. So, what kind of a country would this libertarian dream constitution create? James Buchanan was very, very clear. Again and again, he said his preferred constitutional rules were those of 1900. The constitutional rules of 1900 enabled a place where workers had no legal right to organize for collective voice. We had rolling civil wars between capital and labor as a result. It was a place where corporations were free of democratic accountability, whether for consumer protection, pollution, or discrimination. It was a place where the Supreme Court was perfectly comfortable with mass voter suppression. And it was a place, needless to say, with no Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, and more. This vision is so reactionary that, as Karen Flynn of Common Cause has warned, it seeks to roll back the 20th century. But here we hit another puzzle, because not even the voters who have been so unflaggingly loyal to the current president would not want to live in such a country, right? A country without Social Security and Medicare, without protection for their water supply and more. So how exactly could the Koch-led right carry out this kind of transformation in a functioning, if flawed, democracy? That's where I think my findings bring something new to the table. And that is that I learned through this research that the Koch network's operational strategy to surmount this considerable obstacle depends on stealth. It proceeds through a series of what Koch himself calls interrelated plays, that is, incremental efforts that build on one another in a cumulative manner, so that this cause never has to inform the people of the true end game, or even be honest about the purpose of each play that moves the overall project closer to its destination. There, think Scott Walker with that Act 10. He didn't campaign on destroying the collective power of working people, but that's the first and biggest thing that he wanted to do. Koch puts the method this way. He says, and I think this is actually helpful to think with, because we could do a different version. He said, I often think of what we do as stonemasonry. Once a stone, and here we are in Granite State, right? Once a stone has been carefully selected and set, it shapes a new space in which the mason can set yet another well-chosen stone. Each stone is different, but they all fit together to create a framework that is mutually reinforcing. Again, think of Scott Walker in 2011 with Act 10 as the perfect first stone, dishonestly framed as a budget repair bill that in turn then enabled the voter suppression, the undermining of the environmental measures, the authorization for a constitutional convention, etc. Other elements of this, why I call this stealth, are the Koch network's support of originally tobacco, the industry, and the tobacco industry's denial of the impact of smoking for years. Then they've since moved on to become among the biggest supporters of climate science denial. They also promote the myth of mass voter fraud in order to leverage the notion that some voters aren't legitimate. How else could we have gotten an African-American president? Pushing that notion of mass voter fraud in order to enable voter suppression measures. Why stealth? Again, this is the most important finding, I believe, of my research, and that is because these people know from repeated historical experience that the majority would never knowingly support their true vision. As Charles Koch himself said when he launched this effort in earnest in the late 1990s, he said, since we are greatly outnumbered, he was speaking to an audience of like-minded academics and operatives. Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. So what was that superior technology? These ideas from Buchanan that they have weaponized. It's a system of thinking that is hardly known on the left or in the mainstream, but it has become widespread on the political right. One of Buchanan's greatest gifts to the right was this advice. He said, if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, stop focusing on who rules and instead concentrate on the rules. Not who rules, but the rules. And the idea was to start thinking about how to change the rules to get what you want. Because the fact is, and I know that this book is bracing, and some people have said various responses to it, which I totally get, but the fact is this, and we need to understand this. This radical corporate right felt that they were losing the battle by the 1990s, right, when they adopted this strategy. It's hard to believe when you're talking about such powerful and wealthy and commanding people, but they actually felt desperate, right? Because, why? Because the society was changing, it was becoming more inclusive, the Cold War was ending, even George Herbert Walker Bush was talking about how to apply the peace dividend to do all these meet all these bottled up domestic needs that had been unmet for so long. People were beginning to talk about global warming. We had what was called the Motor Voter Act to bring low-income people into the political process. They had this sense that it's kind of now or never. We have got to start changing things. So it was then, in 1997, that Koch gave his first $10 million gift to Buchanan's Center at George Mason University, where Koch is now the lead donor. And Koch made clear with that first gift just how ambitious, one could say messianic, his vision was. He said this, I want to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries. So to make a long story short, we have all felt that force since, as organizations and elected officials backed by this Koch network have engaged in systematic, radical rules change that has brought us to the current crisis of democracy. We've seen that force in the transformation of one of our major political parties using the penalty of primary challenges from the right and the lure of dark money for compliance in a kind of pincers action to make Republican elected officials carry out the wishes of the donors, even against the desires of Republican voters on issue after issue. The Koch network actually brags about this, as they call it, again, this was Mark Holden, I think, said the accountability play is our secret sauce, so to speak. We've seen that force also in how the Koch network, having harnessed a political party to its purposes and made it obey the will of the donors rather than the voters, has then turned public choice thought into a step-by-step strategy to transform our country into a place none of us would recognize and very few of us would want to live. And I was talking earlier with Janet, who was particularly affected by one part in the story where Buchanan in the mid-1970s writes a piece that has become central to right-wing social thought, but he called it the Samaritan's Dilemma. And in it, he reinterpreted the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Christian theologians will tell you is the heart of the universal ethics of Christianity, what made it so profoundly transformative to say that we are all connected, right? And we have to look out for everyone. Well, Buchanan reinterpreted that passage to say that in the modern world, essentially the ethics of Jesus will mislead you, take you astray. Yeah. That you may actually be exploited by that person on the road who seems to need your help. That you may need to be protected. Well, I mean, you really can't imagine this stuff. I forget exactly the pages, but I understand why Janet wanted me to share it with you, because I think we need to understand that's how radical a transformation this is, right? It is against the best of the teachings of all of the world's great faiths, this libertarian ethical system. I mean, it is an ethical system, but it's quite unique. Okay, so we've also seen that force in Washington, of course, as this transformed party has applied this brinkmanship to make sure that citizens not be given any new reason to believe in government. Not the Affordable Care Act, not card check for labor unions, not immigration reform or action on the climate, not even common sense gun control. And lo and behold, since the inauguration of the current president, the Koch wish list is being granted with epic speed on almost every front while we are distracted by the president's tweets. One administration official actually gloated, this was like 2 weeks ago now, at a meeting with oil and gas corporations. This was reported by The Guardian. He said, and this is a full quote, "One of the things I have found absolutely thrilling in working for this administration is the president has a knack for keeping the attention of the media and the public focused somewhere else, while we all do the work that needs to be done," he said on behalf of the American people when he was meeting with oil and gas executives. I don't think the people were prime in their imaginations. Anyway, and Koch himself also bragged at another donor summit in 2018 that he and the donors together had accomplished more in the past year, i.e. 2017, than in the previous 10. Okay, so what does all of this mean then for folks like us, concerned citizens who are seeing the direction our country is taking and not happy with it, people who are trying to improve the functioning of democracy here in your own state? If we have this Koch battle plan, if we know where this is coming from, and if we understand just how radical the real end game is, what are the action implications for us? I'll close on these. Because we're not going to let them win, right? And I see that all around the country. Nobody's letting this happen. But, okay, so one lesson I think that we can draw from this is that just taking stands on single issues, even big issues like jobs or health care, is no longer going to work as it once did, because our political system has been so upended by this radical billionaire-funded right. Another lesson, a related lesson, is that democracy itself must become a key focus of every progressive cause's work. I know I don't have to tell that to you, but I think it's important to point it out. And also, as part of that, we also need to be alerting the public to the profound danger our democracy faces, and not just from the current occupant of the White House. One public health reader who read the book and wrote to me said, I understand now that this presidency is the tumor, not the cancer. The cancer, in her metaphor, is the chronic problems that enable the acute crisis we're facing now. The escalating and unmatched inequality in our country that has reached literally toxic levels, the spread of dark money in politics, the obstacles to voter participation, the gerrymandering that lets elected officials choose their voters rather than voters their elected officials, the radical changes in legal rules and Supreme Court rulings, and more. So, as a historian who has studied this Koch battle plan and is a specialist in the history of social movements, who has thought long and hard about all of this, I have to say and share with you that I believe the only lasting way out of this acute crisis is deep structural reform of the rules of government. The kind of reform that you're trying to do here in New Hampshire and that others are working on elsewhere. So what kind of structural reform? We need to stop that flow of corporate money, particularly dark, unaccountable, untraceable money to candidates. We need to bring more voters into participation through things like automatic voter registration. We need to rebuild countervailing power to extreme wealth like that of the Koch network, whether it's the power of labor unions or community groups or groups like the, what's your street? Kent Street. All these great local initiatives that are developing, right? And as some activists are putting it, and I think beautifully, we need to start thinking about democracy beyond elections. Elections are crucial, they're important. I don't mean to downplay that, but we need to be thinking about year-round enhanced organization and representation of the people. And we need to unrig the rules that have been so systematically rigged now by the other side. But I will say, too, that there's a kind of fun irony in what we're facing here. I have a weird sense of irony, I know, or whatever. But I really think that there is, and it's one of the things that keeps me being a historian, because it's kind of an antidepressant, because you just see all these things that are going one way, and then you see how something can turn them around. And in fact, what I think is happening here in a deep way that will be part of what those future historians look back on and remark on, is that in trying to take away our shared toolkit of responsive, accountable democracy, something that was so much taken for granted that we didn't even really talk about it for years. I believe that this Koch-led radical right may have done for the rest of us in American society what we have been so unable to do for ourselves for years now. And that is to make us realize how much we have in common and how deeply we need one another to preserve our shared values, our shared victories, our shared achievements, and in fact, to protect our common planet. So I know this is a kind of a startling and bracing message that the book brings, but I want to end here with hope, because I feel so much of it myself. As I mentioned to a few of you, I've been traveling around the country since the book came out, meeting with all kinds of audiences across the spectrum, not just campuses, but across the spectrum of progressive politics, unions, community groups, women's groups, civil rights groups, environmental groups, good government groups, retirees, etc. And what I have been struck by in place after place after place is the breadth of a recognition that we are at a pivotal moment in our history, that this is an all-hands-on-deck emergency for the future of democracy. That understanding is broad, and it's getting deeper and more powerful. You see it, I believe, in the mobilizations for public education, like the Red for Ed teachers movement that started in West Virginia, came to my state of North Carolina, Oklahoma, etc. Lots of these teachers have now run for public office. You see it in the Women's March. You see it in the growth of indivisible groups and local groups like yours here. You see it among the Parkland students in their March for Our Lives. Have you ever seen a group of young people use their privilege so constructively to lift up what is happening to people who've been so long ignored? You see it in the young, brilliant young people of the Climate March. We see it in so many ways. And you can also see it in House Bill 1. that is the first fruit of the 2018 elections nationally. It's a kind of promissory note on the sweeping changes that we need to ensure voter participation, to end this voter suppression, to reform campaign finance, to crack down on corrupting lobbying, and so forth. And it has now been supported by every U.S. senator on the one side. So I think there's a spreading understanding there, as well as at the grassroots, of how important this moment is. This shared sense of urgency that we're seeing among all these people across all kinds of lines, including generational lines, also comes with a recognition that we cannot just keep doing the same things in the same way and expect better results. We have got to step up our game. We have to realize that we too need to think long term. It's okay to develop a vision of the good society that we're aiming towards and think about how to get there. We too must work to build power at the state level, not just at the local level and not just at the national level. We too must work to change the national conversation about government. We too must work to change the courts, to make them more responsive to the people with whom they are so currently, and I'm speaking here particularly of the Supreme Court, out of step. And to do all of this, we must reach beyond our silos and make the kinds of alliances we need to reclaim the future. Because as that old adage goes, there is no crisis that is not also an opportunity. And we, if I gauge correctly what I'm seeing in this room and put it together with what's going on in the rest of the country, I believe that we are going to use this crisis to renew our country. I believe that we are now engaged in the work of reforming democracy to save it. Thank you. Audience. I love being with people who are doing this work. It is so invigorating to me, and it's what I feel like a bee or something. You know, it's like cross-pollinating around the country, sharing the stories that aren't in the news about who's doing what where. Yes.
Thank you very much. I've read your book. I think it's a wonderful contribution to doing what we need to do, and very inspirational. I wanted to ask you about something your book doesn't really touch on. And it has to do with the Congress abdication of its proper authority. We have a wonderful former congressman right here, Chafe. Congress is the Article 1 part of the government. There are 3 equal branches, but the number 1 is Congress. Congress used to have the power to declare war. That's gone. We've been in perpetual war for decades now. None of them declared by Congress with a formal declaration of war. The last power of Congress is the power of the purse. And now President Bush, don't imagine saying that. President Trump is challenging that with his emergency declaration, saying he's going to spend money where the Congress appropriates it or not. Wouldn't you agree that that's part of what we have to do? We have to have Congress reclaim the power it was intended to have as a check on the executive branch.
Absolutely. I think you stated that really eloquently, and I think it's incredibly important. And I think also what the president did in declaring that he was going to defy Congress, which was also obeying the will of the people, that this was not what the people wanted to be doing, is showing precisely the kind of actively anti-democratic impulse that I talk about in the book. But you are quite right that that I didn't get this in the book, and I would say, as my own critic, that I tell a very domestic story. Whereas the Coke cause is actually transnational. They have something called the Atlas Network that has affiliates in over 90 countries. Yeah, you don't want to go there. But the good news is also other people are picking this up and turning a bright light on their affiliates. So it's an exciting moment that way. But I don't talk that much about in the military-industrial complex, if you will, in the book. And that was an irony, too, because in Buchanan's last years, he was at George Mason, which was in Fairfax, which is the Beltway bandits, right? As they were called, the private contractors who were getting federal dollars shifted away from government to profit-making, war-making services. So, and I didn't talk about it because they weren't talking about it, but I absolutely agree with you that we must talk about it. Trump's budget designates 62 cents of every dollar for the military. Like, we have got to pay attention to this. And as you said, if we're about reforming democracy and making it accountable and making it transparent and shining the light on things, then we also need to be shining the light on that aspect of our lives. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for that. Some of our allies and perhaps some of the people in this room have been supportive of an Article 5 Constitutional Convention for the purpose of overturning Citizens United. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that element of it.
Yeah, so there is a wonderful group called End Citizens United, which is fantastic, now has 4 million members. They've gotten 500,000 small contributions. They're part of the reason that we've got all those senators supporting H.R. 1, or the version that would come to them. So I support that effort to get a constitutional amendment in the traditional way against Citizens United, with lots of public deliberation and discussion. I think it would be a suicidal move for progressives to support a constitutional convention at this point. I know there are some organizations that are pushing for that, that seem to have a sense, I don't know where they get it from, that they would be able to prevail at such a convention. If you want to see how far along the right is on this, go to the website of a group called Convention of the States. And they have, it's an incredibly well-developed website. If you write to them, you'll get a call the next morning, if you're like many other people, asking you how you want to get involved and what you can do. And the right is so well organized for this. They've actually also held a mock constitutional convention at Colonial Williamsburg, because they're trying to assure people that it wouldn't be a runaway convention, that they would only make, a few changes to the Constitution. But the left would, and not just the left, the American people, I believe, would be absolutely, totally, and for the longest period of time, utterly routed at a constitutional convention. I think it's incredibly dangerous. So, and I will say too, if you want more information about this, Common Cause has been really leading on this, and you can go to their website. If you just say Common Cause Article 5, they've got a great publication that you could use in community education efforts. They have all kinds of commentary, and they also have up-to-date information. But yeah, I think it would be such a dangerous place to go. Yes?
Could you speak to the Powell Memorandum and its importance or significance to today's situation?
Yes. So the Powell Memorandum, for if people have not heard of it, was produced by Lewis Powell, who was actually a Richmond lawyer who went through this massive resistance era stuff too. But he was asked to write it by his neighbor, who also started the Virginia Commission on Constitutional Government to fight the New Deal. Anyway, was commissioned to write it for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in I haven't talked about it a bit, so 1971, I believe, is when it came out. So the idea was to wake up corporate America and to get them to become much more politically active than they had been, by saying that there was a profound threat to free enterprise in the colleges, in the judicial system, throughout the whole society. So that's been cited as a really key moment in the corporate mobilization to change the courts and the law and higher education. I will say other efforts were going on at the same time. So Buchanan was also kind of making the case that he made. Charles Koch was starting to invest in groups like the Institute for Justice, a really like radical right legal group, but that has had significant Supreme Court victories. The Federalist Society came along later. But basically, all of them were understanding that capturing the courts is crucial to wielding power in a significant and lasting way, and they focused on that with great attention, while the other side did not so much. and we're bearing the fruit of that. So very important document and part of, though, a wider effort in the 1970s to think about how to restore corporate authority and expand corporate power in American society. Yeah.
Yes, so I guess if you're unaware, Open Democracy itself is a nonpartisan organization. And so I guess my question for you is why you see it as a left versus right issue, especially given the fact that, say, for instance, Joe Biden just the other day announced his presidency at the CEO of Comcast's house. And so I guess I don't know if you see. I guess my question for you is why you see it as a left versus right issue rather than a maybe more common people versus the rich and powerful in general.
Yeah.
Issue.
So I will say I don't see it so much as left versus right, but I think I guess I feel like we have to face some facts, which is that one of our political parties has been so transformed by the donor money that it's not operating like it. Like my dad was a Republican. For most of his life, he died in 2000, but he voted Republican, and he was kind of an Eisenhower type of Republican. He was horrified by some of the culture war stuff that the right was doing, but he was very much a Republican. I don't think he would recognize that party today, and I think many Republican voters, and I've met so many of them, are scratching their heads going, what happened to my party? So for example, with the health care legislation, this speaks to your point, I think, about the common people versus the donors, that the three health care bills that were in the Senate, sometimes lose track of time, last year, none of them polled above 18% support by the public. None of them had majority support in any state in the country. And yet, the Republican leadership in the Senate was racing to push those bills through. So again, many Republicans are saying, why is this happening? I don't get this. And I think that what I wrote about in the book helps to explain this, that party is no longer functioning like a normal party. And I'm not the only one to say this. There's many political scientists, economists, and others who have said that. So I would love to get back to a situation of two normal parties where you could have bipartisanship, but just to give you a sense of how powerful the donor control is. Most Republicans want a clean, safe environment, right? And also are concerned about climate change. Well, one of the figures I cite in the book is that by 2014, only 8 of 278 Republican members of Congress would admit that climate change was human-caused. And the reason for that, and that was a change from the 90s, the reason for that is the donor control. They have made it clear that if you acknowledge this, let alone if you try to act on the threat to the planet, they will drive you from office. So we're in a really difficult situation. A bipartisan, Washington Insiders, a bipartisan group, wrote a book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. Now they have a sequel that's called It's Even Worse Than It Was. But they talk about what they call asymmetric polarization, that one party is really polarizing and the other not. So, but I do take your larger point, which is to say I don't think the old labels are helpful to us in many ways in understanding what we're facing. So I tell people, I'm now a conservative. I am, because I want to conserve the popular achievements of the 20th century, right? Let alone the 19th century with public education, but Social Security, Medicare, all of these things that were valued by both parties, anti-discrimination legislation, the Voting Rights Act was bipartisan for so long, but it's not now. And so I know that's uncomfortable, and I'm in a space that's a nonpartisan space, but I'm a historian who's trying to describe the reality I found in the archives. So
Great, thank you.
yeah. I'll take over here and then over here and then back up.
So I less read the book than studied it. And I'm sitting here thinking that when the Trump administration began, most of the people that began the administration were in the department. The White House is turned over, the cabinet is turned over. We've got a crew of acting. The Homeland Security has been vacated. Is the people he was recruiting now directly out of this co-sponsored network?
Well,
Do we know who's doing the work? And is that conspiracy? Or my conspiracy with Russians? Is this a different kind of conspiracy?
So really interesting question. I think that the media have, and there's some really, really wonderful reporters out there like Jane Mayer and others who have tracked the Koch network, but by and large, I think that our media have not served us well in this because they treated the Koch network story as though it were the story through 2015, and then after that it became Donald Trump all the time, right? And they have the sense that they're different, and no matter how much evidence comes forward to say, it's more complicated than that, they're not picking up on this story. They're much more interested in his tweets or, what have you. But in the first part of his administration, some people who do this research showed that 70% of his top appointees came out of Koch network operations. Of course, Mike Pence is deep into this, the vice president who also oversaw the transition team, Scott Pruitt, Betsy DeVos, Mulvaney. You could go through a lot of them, and there have been changes. So I don't, and the changes have been so dizzying. I don't know what the exact number is right now, but there's just so many of them. For example, Stephen Moore, who's been the president's nominee for the Federal Reserve Board, is a deeply, ingrained operative of all of this, who has been in many of these different organizations over the years. And also, even the foreign policy, people are thinking this is just Trump, but it's not just Trump. It is, the Koch network is not only, but also heavily represents the fossil fuel industry, right? The fossil fuel industry is dead set against any action on the threat to the planet, on climate change. And the Koch network, as kind of the advanced guard of that, is determined also to break up international cooperation among governments on the climate. So Brexit, was first figured as this crazy right-wing populist, move from out of the sticks. Well, more and more evidence is coming out that the Koch network affiliates in England were helping the Brexit stuff. So we've just got to get out of this media, I'm sorry, but idiocy that has us just thinking like Trump is sui generis, doing all these things on his own without looking to the deep structures of power that are there. And again, I urge audiences, and maybe this is nonpartisan, say, time out Trump. Just don't pay attention to him for a week. And pay attention instead to the departments and agencies that deal with matters that you care about, and figure out what's going on there or in the courts. And when you do, you start to see a lot of things that you can take action on and that you can deal with. But you will see a lot of this, the Koch influence, because it's quite pervasive. Yeah. And yeah, I'll stop there. My answer's been too long.
And one more. We'll just take one more question.
Back. Oh, yeah. Can I say two? Because they had their hands up. Okay. So back there.
Thank you so much for your talk this evening. It's very instructive. It is overwhelming to me, but I really do appreciate the message of hope at the end as well. And this room gives me a lot of hope as well. But one of the things I keep hearing from a lot of people on the right is this idea that we're not a democracy. We're a republic. And I sense that this is really tied into a lot of this recrafting of the rules. But I also am wondering, I hear that there's the consolidation of power and the consolidation of money, but I'm not always sure I understand what's driving it. Is it purely greed? Is it purely a quest for power?
Yes.
Is it a sense of a social construct? Is it white supremacy? I know the Koch brothers had this connection to Nazism with her nanny as a child and that sort of thing. And what is the why behind all?
Yeah.
What's the end game for these people? Because I don't always understand.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, I think it's not one single thing, right? And I think it is this combination of ideology and interest that fuse, and also in a manner that takes us back to social Darwinism. And in fact, I found these classic social Darwinist texts in Buchanan's office, like William Graham Sumner, if that name means anything, Herbert Spencer, for handy reach at the desk. But I think ultimately, and this is really creepy to say, but I think ultimately the best way to understand this, they're coming up with a kind of economic eugenics, right? In a world in which, it's really frightening if you think about it, that people are being rendered, as the British say, redundant by technology. There's going to be more and more people who are not going to be, able to make ends meet. We're already struggling, and this ideology is something that elevates and almost kind of sanctifies the people who have made it, right? The makers, the productive, the job creators are supposed to be like a special kind of breed of people versus the takers. You know, that just, and Buchanan used language like parasites, predators, etc. Like it's very dehumanizing language that makes you not care what happens to those people, right? That's what these ideas do. They're making you not care about the people who will be shunted aside. In the conclusion of the book, I quote this by Tyler Cowen, who's worked with Cope for like 25 years now at George Mason. This book he wrote, and he said, you know, as some people make it out of poverty, we won't have to care as much about the ones who don't. We'll have favelas-style housing in American cities. He says, you know, some people won't, as wage polarization develops, people won't be able to accept the same quality of water they once did in some communities. He said, America is going to look a lot like, more like Texas. Get used to it. Get ready is what he says. That's what I titled the chapter. But so I think it is that kind of messianic sense of like almost puritanical, like that we're the elect of these people who are so wealthy that they're kind of disconnected from the rest of us, and they don't really understand how people's lives are or what people value. So that's why I say I really do think it's at odds with the best of every major religious tradition, which has a very different set of
Sounds like
ethics.
Nazis, right?
Well, it's not, you know, because it's not racialized now, you know, but it's very unsettling, and it is, again, ideology plus material interest, and a lot of it, I think, being driven by the fossil fuel industry, who has huge sunken costs and huge profits that they'd be walking away from, and it seems like they're willing to do almost anything to preserve them, so it's a really scary situation. But yeah. It's hard to know. It's hard to imagine who would want a world like this and celebrate it as liberty. Yeah. Oh yeah.
I thank you for being able to see me down here, and I thank you for your book and for your appearance here. Very illuminating. My question is: you live in the state of North Carolina, and there was one man who I understand transformed North Carolina, a man by the name of Mr. Pope. Would you speak to that?
Yeah. So there's a man named Art Pope who is part of the Cope Donor Network. He was featured by Jane Mayer in one of her earliest pieces about all of this in the New Yorker. The title of the article was State for Sale, and it was about this figure, Art Pope, who's been working with the Cope since the 1980s. Actually, I found in Buchanan's papers him urging Copes and Buchanan, the whole team, to pay more attention to the states. so, you know, a thinker as well, but he made money in these dollar wholesale store, you know, essentially selling stuff at inflated prices in poor communities, and is a deeply ideological libertarian who personally has built up our whole apparatus. So the three North Carolina affiliates of the State Policy Network that I mentioned before, like your Granite State and Josiah Bartlett or whatever, our analogs to that are funded like 90% each of them by Art Pope, right, and some other people. But so it just shows you, you know, when we, you know, kind of it's on us, right? We let inequality develop to a point in our country where so many of these people have like that kind of wealth to just throw into moving this ideology that is against what most people want, and so Art Pope's been very effective at that. But maybe, again, to end on a note of hope, I'll say two more things. Maybe one is that around the country, that people on the progressive side are beginning to do that. You know, progressive donors coming together and saying, whoa, we don't like what's going on in our states. This is not right. This is not the people we want to be. So my state of North Carolina, it was so transformed in a state that always prided itself on being the moderate beacon, the progressive beacon in the South. So we now have over 130 progressive donors that come together and make long-term investments to help democracy work in our state. So that's really exciting, and that's something that's going on around the country. I'll also tell you about one fun thing, maybe to make you laugh before we go. As I mentioned, campuses are really important to the Cope Network, right? They want the talent pipeline of young people. They want to have faculty members who look like independent authorities who will support these state policy network affiliates and the national stuff. And they want academic defenders for their cause when it gets some hot water. Well, some young people didn't like having their campus used this way. At George Mason at Florida State, it started and thought that this was a violation of academic integrity and of traditional faculty shared governance. So they created a group called Uncoke My Campus. If you're connected to higher education and want them, I didn't bring enough for everybody, but I highly recommend going to their website. They also have all kinds of primary sources from within the network. They tell you about the different campaigns, but I think it's very like Parkland and the climate marches where young people in this new generation are really stepping up to say this is wrong, we need to bring attention to it, and we need to act on it. So anyway, thank you for all you do for open democracy.